I would now like to ask the panelists to come here to the stage. Igor Eitmann, Stefanie Schiffer, Lyudmila Melnik, Alicia Patchevich, Luisa Slavkova. And let me say that we thought that the panel discussion would take place in the form of a fishbowl discussion. This last seat remains vacant. This is from our guests, for our guests from the audience. So don't sit in that chair on the very left. Igor, this is the place for a guest from the audience. The point is the point of a fishbowl discussion is to have live comments from you, the audience, and depending on the topic, I may address someone here in the hall, provided the lights allow me to see you clearly. So thank you for being here and testing this format. Of course, there's a reason for having this panel. On the one hand, I thought it would be important to have different countries represented here, different civil societies, and therefore different views and viewpoints. And we also have different focal areas. I will introduce you a little later to the audience. Alicia has an interview date shortly before 6, so she will leave us here, but just that you know why she leaves, but we will get support from the audience.
In my speech, I tried to briefly sketch the topic that we are going to discuss here. I tried to describe it already from my perspective and maybe from our perspective. It is this big agenda for the next years: overcoming war, overcoming imperial policy, and dictatorships. In Europe, we have many countries that don't have dictatorships and maybe not even imperial policy, but we all have war, although it hasn't arrived in our country yet, or only immediately. Indirectly. Yes, these are the implications of dictatorships. We can't avoid them. And I am convinced of the following. I have learned that the 4 organizations that have been banned by Russia here in Germany are represented here on the panel, with the exception of the DRA. But I didn't really notice this. It is the Forum of Russian-Speaking Europeans, founded by Igor Eitmann. He's from Russia. He is a historian and a journalist. He worked as the communication head for the market research agency, and he has been here now for 10 years, and he founded the Forum Russian-Speaking Europeans and also the Human Rights Dialogue. He is a political scientist and a blogger, and his organization was banned. Like the European Platform for Democratic Elections and the European Exchange, Stefanie Schiffer founded both together with the DRA, and since 2008, she is heading many different programs within this exchange. Quorum, Kyiv conversations, everything that is very important and very visible, and that contribute to our opinion formation process. Then we have Iryna Solonenko. She is fellow with the Center for Liberal Modernity. This is the 4th forbidden and banned organization, but most in the hall will know it is one of the organizations that for years has been committing itself to making Ukraine visible, to making sure that their interests are also represented and seen. This is part of and making sure that Ukraine is part of Europe. And they have been very successful in communicating this. Iryna was born in Ukraine, and she worked for the OSF, and she headed the European program from 2000 until 2012. She worked at the East-West Institute in Kyiv. She worked as a fellow for the Center of Liberal Modernity. She is working on reform processes, foreign policy, and European integration there. She participates in the Bertelsmann Transformation Index. Again, transformation, we talked about it already, and she also worked as the Viadrina University, or works there. And the two other colleagues who I asked to join this panel for us stand for the transformation issue, but for themselves, they stand for an active civil society and civic education. And this basically brought us together. Alicia Patchevich is the head and founder of the Center for Citizenship Education in Warsaw, and she is an economist by trade, but for many years she has been active in the area of education and civic education, and she is an expert of the Polish Education Ministry. And for the ministry, she launched and developed interesting and important programs, textbooks, School with Class, Traces of the Past, and others. So things that definitely hasn't had an impact and have an impact on society. And Luisa Slavkova comes from Sofia, that is from Bulgaria. She heads the Sofia platform. This is where and how we met. And at the same time, she is also active in many other organizations and networks. She used to be a member of the NICI, of the advisory board and the NICI, and now she is a co-founder of a new organization, Civics it's called, and this will be one of my first questions, i.e. how can civics be interpreted and summarized if our societies are so different? She advised the Foreign Ministry, and the European Council for Foreign Relations was also one of her employer, so she has expertise in many different fields. Thank you very much for being here. And I would like to start with Igor, because recently there was a reason for me to approach him and to apologize for me being wrong. Igor, for a long time, had been criticizing Putin, and he said he is a clear dictator, a totalitarian thinker that doesn't accept anything else. That's what he has been saying for a long time. And Putin basically acts like a fascist, he said. And this is something that we in Germany, and we had fascism in our country, it quickly say no to. We would often say, no, don't call it a fascist, or don't call people a fascist. Together with Demokratia and other activists, he called the protest camp Stop Putin's Terror. And I said, do we really have to use the term terror? And he said, yes, we do. Terror that used to be intermittent, here a cyber attack, there a killing, there an attack on a region, has now become a fully fledged war. Now, Igor, how did you foresee this and forecast this? Why didn't others forecast it as well? At least not that strongly. In Putin's world, the war against Ukraine is logical. And why are we so shocked then? Why was your mindset and thinking different compared to ours? Yes, there is no doubt that it has been clear for a long period of time what this will result in. It wasn't just clear to me, but I wrote about it a lot. Now, what is happening at the moment doesn't happen accidentally. It was clear that this would happen, and unfortunately, this is not the final result, but it is a temporary result of developments of Putin's regime in Russia. Our opposition members that I highly respect in Russia have been talking about the party of thieves for a long time. They talked about thieves and bandits, but unfortunately this is not enough. Of course they are thieves and bandits, but that's not the most important thing. The most important thing is that they are fascists. They have a fascist ideology. The ideology that they discuss everywhere, in their saunas, in their bunkers, wherever they meet and get together. This ideology is very close to the fascist ideology of Hitler or Mussolini. maybe it is not totally and clearly anti-Semitic for different reasons. One reason being domestic, another being foreign policy. But actually, it comes down to the same ideology. It is the ideology of imperial rule, if not over the entire world, but at least over a certain area. The former Soviet Union territory, for sure. They also have this leader ideology, and they do have a leader. It is Putin. After the Secretary General, Stalin, there has never been such a concentration of power with the leader in Russia. We only knew this from fascist countries. They despise other ethnic groups, other countries, including Ukraine, and they do not accept that Ukraine is a separate and independent country. And also Putin's thinking and mindset is very similar to Nazi and fascist mindsets of Hitler and Mussolini. Also his domestic policy. I mean, there is market economy in Russia, but the government interferes basically everywhere and dominates everything, including the business sector, including private property. And that is very similar to Hitler. And there we had Krupp Steel and other big companies that became agents basically of the government and the state, these big companies. And the same also happened in Russia. It's in the 2000s, in the mid-2000s, these entrepreneurs and companies became servants, basically, of the Putin regime, and they administer the property in the interest of the state, in the interest of the government, so they could protect their property and wealth, but they can find, or could find themselves in prisons at any time if they act wrongly. And we have seen this already in different cases. I don't want to delve into detail, but Putin's state is very close to the state of National Socialists or fascists. 5 years ago, I published a book with the Heine Publishing House. It is called Putin's System, Where Does the Russian Empire Go? And it includes the main features, but the German society didn't listen to me. In this book, I found and wrote that this regime cannot develop peacefully. This regime needs monopolies, needs enemies. Only then will they be able to justify themselves. Only then will they be legitimized. Only then will they mobilize their own population. It started with local wars, with smaller wars. In Chechnya, it started with wars in Syria, for instance, and now we see a more global war. And if Putin managed to really enact Ukraine, then this is going to be a European or a global war. It could also be a nuclear war. I wrote about this, and Thomas Wiedling, my literature agent, maybe you know him, he's one of the best agents and, best experts on Eastern Europe, and he deals also with Russian literature. And he wrote me today that this was a very important book. We have to print the second edition. So this mindset has become mainstream today, and the global threat that comes from Putin, we need to understand. He is threatening mankind. It shouldn't sound pathetic. I don't think that Putin wants a nuclear war, but his politics and all the developments that we have seen unfortunately enable these disastrous results. And he will expand, or he will want to expand more and more to Ukraine, to the Baltic states and others. And like with Hitler, others tried to appease him, and this will also be done with Putin, and then there might be a world war. In other words, I hope that real measures will be taken. Firstly, Putin has to be stopped. with violence, with power. You cannot just talk to him. You cannot negotiate with him because it is totally obvious that he is no longer thinking straightforward and normally. And this, again, is similar to Hitler and Stalin. And if you want to calm down a psychopath, why? Oh, this would only provoke him in his ambitions. He will eventually see that people will try to persecute him, and this will just aggravate his actions and activities. In other words, it's very important for the Western powers to stop Putin as early as possible, if possible, in Ukraine. Thank you very much.
This is a very drastic view of the situation, but unfortunately it has completely justified itself. Irina. Ukraine is now under pressure, the target, and it has to fight back with all strength and power and great motivation. Since 2014, the Ukrainians have kept saying this is a war. Nobody seemed to listen, with the exception of a few experts, but the rest of the world didn't take it seriously. There was not murderous shooting every day, so why was that supposed to be a war? Why has Ukraine been unable to communicate the truth to the world? Why it is now much stronger? And from your point of view, what is the best possible scenario? What's the worst scenario possible? Can I have the first question again? Why was Ukraine unable to communicate its situation it is in to the world and pursue politics that would have helped it? Why is it so strong now? And the thing about the scenarios. Thank you very much. From my point of view, the crisis started in November 2013. At the time, Ukrainian President Yanukovych was about to sign the association agreement with the EU, which he didn't. Putin promised him billions worth of credit so that he would not sign the association agreement. If the scenario had worked out, if Ukraine would have turned into a vassal state of Russia, there would be no war now. Then we would be the kind of country Belarus is now, but Russia would not have attacked us. But Ukraine resisted, and for 3 months we had the revolution of dignity, or the Euromaidan as it was called, where 100 people were killed as well. And right afterwards, we saw the invasion of Crimea, the occupation of territories in Donbass. So for me, it was quite clear what was happening. Then there was the Minsk process, in which Russia tried to curtail Ukrainian sovereignty and independence, forcing Ukraine to grant a special status to the occupied territories. So that was the second scenario of Putin, to keep Ukraine under control. It didn't work. 2014, Ukrainian society clearly set a number of red lines. We will not cede any territories. Crimea and Donbass will be part of Ukraine. We will not negotiate with so-called separatists. And to begin with, Ukraine must have control of its own borders, and only then will it be possible to hold elections in the occupied territories, and so on and so forth. So here too, Putin was equally unsuccessful. Using weapons was his last means. So full-scale invasion was the only method left, and this is what we have now. From a Ukrainian point of view, We have had a long history of Russian suppression, and from a Ukrainian perspective, it's now the last battle which we must not lose. We must win, because it's about the survival of the Ukrainian state and Ukraine as a political nation. Yet I think it's also about more about security and coherence in Europe. Now the European Union has the chance to make historic decisions and to offer Ukraine a candidate status. That would have been an important political signal. Just as I said that the war started with the non-signature under the association agreement. So we need a clear signal now from the EU that we are part of Europe. The worst case scenario. I often hear a discussion in Germany about scenarios and how long it's necessary to withstand all that. I think we shouldn't discuss that. We should understand that if Ukraine loses that war, it's a disaster for Europe and the whole world. We must pool all resources now, all forces, so that Ukraine can stand up to Russia, that Russia can be pushed back and is unable to fight that war with military means. That should be our scenario. There is no other choice for no one. Alicia, for a long time, we kept calling Russia an authoritarian regime, not a dictatorship. We made a fine distinction. We said, well, we in the EU have trouble with a number of countries, with Mr. Orban, with Mr. Kaczynski, but we still see differences. It's an important issue for Polish civil society now more than ever, because it fights back against incursions and attacks on the rule of law. What about now, when Poland takes in so many Ukrainian refugees? It looks as if everyone is united now and stands united, looking at it from outside. And now that times are so difficult, how can democracy be protected by civil society?
So many difficult questions. I don't know the answers, but I'm ready to look for them. And most of them are new. And this is something that has happened within the last weeks. I would like to start with, I liked very much both of your speeches, and I completely agree that we and the collective West has underestimated the ambitions, almost Tsarist ambitions of Putin. And that the Ukrainians pay the price for our negligence. There were many occasions when Poland, but also European Union, could have supported more the Ukrainian ideas about where Ukraine wants to belong to and how it should be done. And we didn't support this. One thing which I can say in our defense was that Poland, like many other post-communist countries, were warning the West that Putin's dictatorship is dangerous. And very often it was treated as a sort of a sign of a post-communist stress disorder, that you are exaggerating, that, you know, it won't happen, and so on. And now we can see that it was not paranoia. It was much more realistic assumption of the global situation that many politicians in the West had. And what you were saying, Irina, this war is not about Ukraine. This is about all of us. This is about democracy. This is about the values that we stand for. So for me, and I'm really happy, and I'm even proud of the Polish civil society that we have been able to behave in such a way, because it was not sure. You know, civil society in Poland is, you never know what will come out of it. Luckily, also because of the long years of historical ties, this is really, open heart attitude. And I was presenting during the last session a photo, I can show it later, of a girl who was born three days ago from the family from Ukraine, which I was hosting. There were 7 people, 2 pregnant women, and one of them gave birth. I already know the name of the girl is Dana. So, and this is, also the civil society is not something which you can steer. It builds in contact. It builds by activity. It builds by, everyday experience. So one thing which is, and I think that it's not only Poland. It's Moldova, it's Slovakia, it's Hungary, Bulgaria, Germany. I have even, my old friend from the university has called me 2 days ago and said, I am a leader of a shoes production industry association in Europe. I have an offer of 500 workplaces in Portugal for Ukrainians and their families. We will train them. Can you give me, a person to whom I can propose it to? So this is, I think that maybe one of the results of this conflict is this network of people helping each other and also forging ties for the future. And and this is the real, weapon against dictatorship, totalitarianism, and Putin. Of course, we also need real weapons. I mean, I completely agree that Ukraine cannot be left alone. And many Poles are advocating it, and also even the government, who has some heads before different attitudes toward European Union. Now we are really united in our common will to stand for Ukraine and to stand for democracy, which is also standing for all of us.
Okay.
I have to. Does it work? I have to go, and this is not an interview. This is a meeting with 60 mayors of towns, Polish towns, who are now trying to solve the problem of education of Ukrainian children in Poland. And I have an online meeting with them, and this is really a mess, believe me. But civil society and local governments are doing well, trying to survive and solve all the issues. Thank you very much. Sorry.
Yeah, as a civil.
Okay, so civil society is growing also at the moment. I think that we can also see it. The question is, can you overcome dictatorships with this? But at least thousands of people can be helped. And we can see that help is very specific, very nice. Stephanie, when you moved to St. Petersburg in 1992, you had a mission, and your mission was to foster civil society initiatives and encounters. and to meet the respective actors. This morning, we had a brief conversation, and we were both thinking, okay, now we have to start again from scratch. 30 years later, we have to start from scratch. And I was thinking it's actually worse, because in 1992, despite all issues, after the collapse of the Soviet Union, I mean, it was a period of starvation. It was a difficult time, but there was more freedom and less war. Where do we stand today? And what is the future going to be like? What do we have to do now? And where is the difference to 1992? Can we learn anything from our experience of 1992? Stefan and I set up a signal group, and we always exchange small ideas. And this morning we had the idea, okay, yeah, we should start from scratch. And the next idea was, is it easier or more difficult now compared to 30 years ago? We haven't answered this question yet, but I think easier. No, it is not easier nowadays. Of course, it is totally different. These were our ideas and thoughts this morning. I'm very happy to be here. And we can look back at 30 years. Not everybody sitting here, but some of us can look back. Rudi Pivko founded the DRA. He's here. And Franco, he worked with us in Petersburg. And Stefan Malerius is here. So despite the masks, I can see who you are, Kerstin and others. And we can really look back at these 30 years. At the time, we experienced democracy in Russia, and it was very impressive for me personally in the early 1990s, the very vivid and new democracy in Russia. And that was a very shaping impact, and that shaped me. I was at the end of my 20s, and it was really great to see that people wanted to shape the future. They wanted to set up a democratic Russia. And under Putin, of course, it was stifled immediately. But we have to face that we eventually need a democratic Russia for a democratic and free Europe. But we shouldn't talk too much about Russia. I believe in this, by the way, and we all should believe in this. It will eventually happen. We don't know when, but it can also happen very quickly. And then we have to be positioned accordingly and become active in this direction. And I'm very clear, and I know that we are going to do this. But today we should focus on Ukraine. Ukraine is important to us. Ukraine is in the center of our attention, and I subscribe to everything that Iryna has said. We have to show solidarity with Ukraine nowadays, and not just provide humanitarian solidarity. There's a huge wave of providing help to Ukrainians who are here in the humanitarian field, but we also have to show political solidarity with Ukraine. Every Ukrainian gets help here, yes, of course, and then we have to ask ourselves, won't they stop fighting at some point? And this is absurd. I mean, Ukrainians do not just deserve our social and humanitarian solidarity, but also political solidarity. And that includes no acceptance of territorial losses. No peace with Putin. No, the goal has to be we are going to support Ukraine until this terror regime has been toppled and defeated. And I think we have to become a bit more honest about this. It is a very difficult situation, I do know this, but the determination of Ukrainians is really impressive, and it has to drive us. We have to show political solidarity with them as well. And by the way, also in terms of security policy, we have to show political solidarity, and also we have to set up the security architecture in Europe in a way that the Ukraine is also protected against Russia. I think we cannot just say civil society, humanitarian aid only. We need to provide security in terms of political security, and we have to also sort out the issue of energy. Everybody is surprised. How could we become so dependent from Russia? We didn't really want to know it. Our federal government did not make reasonable decisions, could not make reasonable decisions, because we are dependent on Russia in the area of energy. This is a scandal, and we need to discuss this, and we need to get out of this trap. Oh, I'm getting angry, but yeah, this is the situation. We can no longer accept that we cannot act and are too dependent on Russia. So we cannot just focus on business issues and reasonable production conditions. Yeah, I could continue this list. Because I often ask myself, okay, yes, in conflict-free times, it might work if the gas pipes are owned by Gazprom, and if the gas warehouses are also owned by Gazprom. But if both are owned by one party, then it is dramatic. Also, the old pipelines, they go to Schwedt, and Schwedt is owned to a majority by Russian corporations. Everything is terrifying. But I think it also changed our civil societies, because we now also start thinking about these economic ties and structural issues. I mean, we have been talking and writing about Nord Stream 2 for a long period of time as an anti-European project, also bad for climate protection. But at the end of the day, we are now in a situation where we have to deal with totally different topics, and we also need to collect expertise in different areas. However, I would like to come back to our starting point. So we try to train people to act and behave democratically, and we hope that once they have the majority, they can prevail, which is not automatically the case, of course. So, Luisa, we also have a common history in terms of having overcome communism, also as a dictatorship. And this overcoming is a lesson that we have learned, is something that we can remember, and that eventually also fosters democracy, at least potentially. How can we make this happen? If we have the individuals that we train, yes, if we train them, then we have to train millions of people. And it's not that easy to do this for NGOs. Or if you convince the ministries of education and those who set up the curricula, where should you start this process? And I'm asking this because what is going to happen in Russia someday in this area?
So thank you very much, first of all, for having me and having us, and happy birthday to the German-Russian exchange. It's impressive what is the history you're looking back at. So regardless of how difficult the situation might be, also for your founders and the first associations and members who've been part of it, because this is definitely a moment of rethinking. It's just to say how impressive it is, what a long history you're looking at. Now, it became clear that just like Alicia, our organization too, and other colleagues in the room are part of this network that we put together in 2014 as we were marking 25 years since the fall of the Berlin Wall. And I think the prevalent word at that time was freedom. And things look so differently now, 5-7 years later. And we published since then a couple of small booklets. I think you find some of them in the entrance. And there was one sentence that I find myself coming back to, and it is about this holy trinity, I would say, of democratization in general. You cannot advance or keep consolidating democracy in a country without having democratic elites, democratic institutions, and also a general democratic culture that has arrived in society. And I think the moment one of these starts falling through the crack, you have deterioration of democracy. So that's a very general, or a big generalization that I'm making. But so one of the things we have been observing in societies like the Bulgarian, for example, is that there has been a very strong focus on institutions and elites. But in that respect, the political culture of people has been left behind a little bit. So the focus on the contribution of, I don't know, what good curricula can do, or what civic education, both formal and non-formal, can have as contribution has been left aside. But that's one topic, I think. However, even with good civic education, the one question that I find myself coming back to since the beginning of the war in Ukraine is, how was it possible that we adopted, speaking, everyone basically west from Ukraine somehow, adopted a mindset that made it impossible for us to believe all the messages that we kept receiving for more than 10 years. So we did not take a person seriously, even though that was klartext, these were clear threats. So how comes, and I keep coming to a very perverted thought, which is that somehow democracy makes us, or peace makes us somehow into lazy Democrats. So in a way, I start doubting progress, I start doubting what we're able to achieve, because somehow, in a couple of decades, we need to come back to, big disruptions, big crises, wars, so that we get reminded about basic things. And this is scaring me, but it's also making me really question the contribution that we're able to make. And so, similar to probably the thoughts you're having, we're having them too. How comes the whole conversation about interconnectivity and how much interconnectivity has also a downside? So we kept thinking, if we're interconnected, and the more economically interconnected we are, the less possible a war is, right? Because we keep profiting from each other. However, this is not true. On the contrary, it makes us vulnerable. How could we possibly decouple so much politics from military in a way? So, when you think of this discussion about the 2% that's been ongoing in Europe for I don't know how long, or the almost non-existent conversations about defense policy within the European Union. And so I'm thinking again, how could we arrive to this mindset? And I don't have an answer, because honestly, throughout the event today, I have been thinking, I admire some of the colleagues in the room who are able to distance themselves and to discuss the past, think about the future, also take the conversation to a meta level. And the moment we had an Ukrainian colleague turning on from Ternopil, I don't find the words anymore.
Together with colleagues from Croatia and Germany, you founded the Civics organization. Do you think that you can really bring things together cross-border, or will they remain regional, especially when people start thinking about defense? So what commonalities are there and what is not common?
Actually quoting our Ukrainian colleague from today, so the Civics is a pan-European civic education organization. The reason to found it an year or so ago was to say civic educators, and when we speak about civic education, we speak about the broader sense of civic education. Civic education needs a irrigation system in Europe, so that knowledge, experience, projects, ideas, peer-to-peer learning has an opportunity to flow, right? And it should not come top-down from within European institutions. It should really be a way for civic educators specifically to connect. Because what happens very often in times of crisis is that civic educators are called to act, but oftentimes they don't have the support to do so. And I find in the exchange a great added value exactly in finding that support. And so what our colleague from Ukraine said today was that in one of the online conversations we organized only just 10 days ago, just to see, to get together the network, to see how civic educators make sense of the situation right now. And she was sharing today on the screen that this was the moment when she herself, as an Ukrainian, got to think also about the impact of the war on other societies. I mean, as Staszek was quoted today, now there are 40% more people in Warsaw, or 40% more than Warsaw can actually accommodate. And it's not the time now to think about what's the impact of the war on all of us. It's the time to think about the impact of the war on Ukrainians themselves, first and foremost. But still, I think this anecdote is showing what is the added value, I think, of the type of work we're trying to do, of the type of work you're trying to do, of the type of work other colleagues in the room are trying to do. So the added value of networked, connected endeavors, umbrellas.
Ich erinnere daran, dass wir hier eine Fishbowl-Diskussion machen, jetzt.
Well, this is a fishbowl discussion, and I would like to open it now and offer those two chairs here. So you can either put your hand up and say something here, but you have to come to the stage. It mustn't be a long statement, it can be just one idea. But I could also ask someone to sit with us here, or my colleagues can do that, because we think it would be interesting to have your input. So if someone is interested, please raise your hand and come here. I have a question to Igor. We see, although we are disappointed, but it's not quite unexpected, that there are no major protests in Russia against the war. Supposedly the numbers supporting Putin even grow. But now the Russian-speaking civil society members living abroad now have a burden to bear. Thousands of them have fled. They went to different places all over Europe. So what can these Russians abroad do, and what can they not do? We have representatives of this diaspora network here. It would be great to have someone from the audience up here to share their experience with us. Well, what they cannot do is that they will not be able to bring about regime change. They cannot lead Russia into democracy. They cannot get rid of the dictator Putin. What is happening right now is this. It's about people saving themselves. They just save themselves, their families, from this very difficult situation. It's not a financially difficult situation, but the atmosphere is bringing moral pressure to bear on people, because it's a totalitarian atmosphere in a fascist state, terrorizing people having a different view. These people do not draw up tasks before them, as we had it when the first Russians emigrated in the first years of Bolshevism. They all saw themselves responsible for riding back with a flag in their hands and reconquering the Red Square. There's no such atmosphere now. People save themselves. Then they also somehow try to be useful to their homeland. Those who left just now have lots of things to do for their own sake. But those who have been living in Berlin for a long time, Demokratia, for example, is represented here. They have regular demonstrations. There will be an activity on Saturday to protest the war and Putin's terror regime and the suppression of civil society. We have this quotation from the first wave of migrants after the revolution. We are not in exile, we are an embassy with a message, and our role is to explain who we are, what those in power, who those in power are, and what we can do to fight the global evil starting in the Kremlin. I think this is a very important task now. We are aware of that task, we as migrants from Russia, and we try to do it. My colleagues here already mentioned the next thing I wanted to say. The West failed to understand for a long time who usurped power in Russia. They always tried to take a rational approach, saying, well, they will not wage war because there are so many close economic ties with the rest of the world. But rational arguments no longer work. They didn't work with Hitler and Stalin, Mussolini, and they will not work with Putin. We know how they tick. We have to be aware that the Western public, that people in the West need to be taught, because there was a lot of naivety. Iryna, you put your hand up. I have to add something concerning the support of the war in Russia based on the surveys done by Nevada Center. The trend is rising, 60–70% support. And I read an analysis just recently, and they say that 50% of those surveyed said, that was in early February, that they use the internet on a daily basis. A couple of weeks later, only 37 still use the internet. And internet users no longer respond to such service, so the support goes up because people are less well informed. So surveys do not work in dictatorships, even if a reputable organization carries them out. I read the numbers, but you shouldn't believe any of that. I would like to raise a few more problems here. The war shows us that the international order and the international organizations and structures that were built up after the Second World War, United Nations, the OSCE, the Red Cross, are unable to do anything. I'm not talking about creating peace. They are not even able to organize humanitarian corridors. The whole world watched while people in Mariupol were killed. A genocide was taking place and nobody did anything. From a Ukrainian perspective, I must say that the whole multilateral order discredited itself. And many humanitarian organizations are no longer in Ukraine. Those were the ones that organized horizontal networks, established relations with suppliers of medicines, food, daily necessities from abroad, and they are no longer there. When the war is over, we need to think about what to do with all the ruins that are left. We need to build something new from scratch. We should be aware of that. Well, and perhaps we shouldn't start doing that after the war, but we should do it right now. Thank you for raising the issue, because we need to be aware of not just the weakness, but the failure of a whole range of important organizations, the Council of Europe, the OSCE, and many others, and it's a drama. So I invite again anyone willing to give an input here to come to the stage. Tell us briefly who you are and what you want to say. Good afternoon, and let me congratulate the DRA on its 30th anniversary. Perspectives Hoch 3, this is the organization I'm included. I'm coming from there. We have been a long-standing partner of the DRA. I came here to celebrate, but unfortunately, this is not the time to celebrate. And we had to strike more somber notes. As a private person, but also as a politologist, I would like to say a number of things from the perspective of German organizations, also to respond to what you raised here. Well, we became too dependent on Russia and its energy supplies. I agree with that. Yet we also have to wonder now, what can we do if we want to support a sustainable development? We do not want to become dependent on the next dictator. And when I see our economic affairs minister in Dubai or Saudi Arabia, which is now engrossed in another war, I wonder whether we spend the money for oil and gas in the right place. We have to give up part of our prosperity here. We have to give up part of our gross domestic product if we want to cut down on our economic ties with dictatorships. So this is what we can do. We will probably not have to die, but we have to give up part of our prosperity if we want to become independent of fossil sources of energy, and we must become politically active. I also want to address the unpleasant issue of nuclear threat. So Perspektiven Hoch 3 deals with generations in dialogue and an East-West conflict. As a person with East German roots going to school in the 1980s, I learned a lot about the nuclear war and the nuclear threat, and many people suddenly remember that, and you find yourself in an entirely helpless situation. We know that we need to get politically active, and we need to say our share our views, but we are still frightened. I find it also unpleasant to talk about that, but I think we need to do it. I personally ask myself, how can I declare my solidarity with Ukraine? But what actually does it mean? All right, I save energy. I try to use only renewable energies. But that, I mean that serious, even if it sounds a bit funny at the moment. But this dependence on fossil fuels that comes from dictatorships is no longer acceptable. So when my friends ask me, what have you done apart from declaring your solidarity? I say, well, I try to help people that I think I could help. So this helplessness must be overcome and must be turned into something positive, to think about a way to strengthen international institutions to support peace in the world everywhere. So this is something where we all have to think about what to do, not just to donate 200 euros. We need to change our own lifestyle. Sustainability is also peace policy. Thank you, Judith. I would appreciate Peter Liesegang to come here. Shakes his head. Well, the idea is that I'm interested in Belarus. We have a Belarus working group. You organized it, coordinated it, and there are lots of people looking after that, but this is now also somehow going, disappearing. And I'm really worried because the country is about to lose its independence. So I would like to know, if you want to say something, Peter, what can be done there? And how do we remember the end of the war this year on the 8th and 9th of May? Do you want to say anything about it? No. What a pity. So let me just in general say that we need to think ahead. The next Memorial Day is the 8th and 9th of May, when over the past few years we allowed here in Berlin an imperial and monopolistic culture of remembrance was allowed to be demonstrated here. So St. George's ribbons and Soviet-style celebrations, and the night wolves came here, motorcycle gangs, and what they managed to do was to push aside the remembrance of the end of the war that is more forward-looking. And this year we must do all we can not to permit that again. I'm saying that in general, but there is an initiative that will address the issue openly, and it was Peter's idea to do that. So, Fyodor Kashinenikov. Fyodor is from Vilnius. I understand German, but my German is too limited for a discussion. I would like to speak in Russian, and I can confirm everything that the previous speakers said, Stefan especially. I cannot stop wondering about the attitude of some Western intellectuals, as if it happened only yesterday and not over the past 20 years for everyone to say. Jefferson Littell's letter really caught me by surprise. He sent a letter to the Russian population asking, why don't you protest? The Ukrainians are about to be defeated by the Russian regime, and after that, you will be under attack. I would like to correct him. He first clamped down on the Russian population to be undisturbed in his ambitions to attack others. I do not want to produce any parallels here and wouldn't want to call him fascist. Salazar in Portugal is perhaps a suitable comparison. There are more similar features there than in other fascist dictatorships. It's possible to destroy everyone who holds a different view. Putin managed to build up militarism, to build a dictatorship, and it happened before everyone's eyes, and no one said anything. Boris Nemtsov was killed after the annexation of Crimea. And what about the war in Georgia? When the war in Georgia happened, I thought, well, I can't return to Russia right now because there will be a wave of sanctions now. And I was surprised that no sanctions at all were imposed. So what do you expect of 2014? Hamdashvili was killed in Berlin in broad daylight, and no sanctions were imposed at all. Interestingly enough, Michael Friedman is among those in favor of sanctions and said, well, what do you think? Can I tell Putin something now? I can't, and he's right. The sanctions against the oligarchs were developed by Navalny. At the time, everyone was in favor, but at the time, the oligarchs had a say. A couple of years ago, the sanctions against them would have had an effect, but now, after the COVID virus, after the isolation and the lockdowns, it's impossible. The oligarchs have no longer access to Putin. He's now living with people of whom we know next to nothing. We don't even know where they are from. So I have a worst-case scenario, which is not a real good one. It's a real bad one. Now, Putin will do all he can in order to try to attack the borders of Donetsk and Luhansk, to recognize that, and to secure the Crimean Canal. And then everyone will say, we are in favor of peace. Everyone is much more interested in peace. And then the borders are fixed for many years to come. In Russia, Putin will celebrate a victory. The Iron Curtain will go down and terror will continue for many, many years. Ukraine will lose its territories, and everyone will say, well, but the neutral status is better than nothing. No one wants war. It's going to be a terrible situation. We are going to have it for many years. Ukraine lost territories, lost Crimea, Donbass, but what can you do? You can't carry on, continue with that war forever. So there will be terror behind the Iron Curtain, that is in Russia, and we in the West will say, well, not everyone is in favor of Putin. Either they are imprisoned or abroad, and when we talk about how things are to continue, we will have to return to the sad reality of the 1950s and 1960s. So how things will continue after the Iron Curtain is entirely unclear, when you have a mad leadership of whom you need must be prepared to expect anything. What do you do with those who stayed there? What do you do with those who left, saying that you mustn't conclude any agreements with cannibals because they will anyway be eaten up? That's my opinion. That's not the worst case scenario, but it was pretty bad. May I answer something here? Of course, we should discuss that, and of course, we know that Putin has a plan until the 9th of May. He wants to occupy Lugansk and build, set up a corridor to Crimea, but Ukrainian society doesn't accept it. Just as it did not accept the fact that the association agreement was not signed. Zelensky knows it just as well as anyone else. So this is not going to be a peace we will be willing to accept. It's just unacceptable. Anyone else wants to say anything?
Stell dich bitte kurz vor und dann sprichst du.
Dear friends, colleagues, I am an old ally of the DRA. I'm the manager, I'm a cultural manager, an artist, a photographer, and more than 7 years ago, we emigrated. I and my wife emigrated from Russia, and this was a sign of protest against what was happening there at the time. I try to be brief. We are discussing only very few aspects of the crisis that is happening at the moment and that has global implications. But as an artist who many years ago, during Soviet times, raised the issue of the Stalinist Gulag and started thinking about good versus evil. So I, as an artist, can say that I can feel very strongly that there is kind of a shockwave happening at the moment. This is kind of a shockwave of the real crisis, of the crux. And our organization in Berlin can become the place that is able to talk about a bigger crisis, the crisis of civilization that we are going through. Because we're not experiencing just a crisis of the Putin regime and its contacts to Ukraine and the EU. We are confronted with a spiritual and global crisis. And we have to face that. In addition to my democratic convictions, I'm also a convinced Christian. And I can see also that the church is going through a huge crisis. The Russian church, the Protestant and the Catholic churches. I can see how deep this crisis is as well. And unfortunately, on this panel and also on the previous panels, we do not see a dialogue with representatives from the church or from churches, with representatives of different denominations in our contemporary societies. It's terrible to see that there have been pedophile scandals in the Catholic Church. It is terrible to see that there is this megalomania in the Russian Orthodox Church. It is terrible to watch global marketing and to watch the opportunism that the developed market economies are showing and displaying, because they close their eyes to many things for the sake of business. I think that today, with our modest possibilities, with the power of cultural activists that are also going through a serious crisis, we have to initiate in deep dialogue on what is happening to us. We have to invite philosophers. We have to invite authorities from the different denominations and churches, representatives of the political world, of different organizations, etc. And there's another aspect that deeply hurts me and that is very painful. I am an ethnic Ukrainian. I was born in Zhytomyr because my father was an enemy to the people. He could not live and stay in Ukraine, so he emigrated to Kaliningrad, where he felt more free. And I basically communicated between Ukraine and Russia in the past. And now in Ukraine, we can see a tendency where Ukrainian artists and cultural activists do not want to have anything to do with the Russian culture anymore. The Russian culture cannot exist under the conditions of collective responsibility. Having said that, I would like to ask our Ukrainian colleagues and friends to take a differentiated approach. It is already very difficult for us Russian artists that have been part of the opposition for many years. So let us fight this fight together. It is now 6:30. Thank you very much for sharing this with us, Dima. And I would like to come back to our four panelists. And I have one question for all of you. For the next 2 weeks or 2 months, but not longer, so for the immediate future, please give us 2 tasks. What should we do now? I think that the main task for the Russian democratic society and also for Russians that live in exile and for Germans is to provide help to Ukraine, to continue to provide help. It can take different forms. I'm talking about humanitarian aid and help, and everything is pretty well organized in Germany. But I talked to Ukrainians, and they say that the West should help Ukraine much more and can help Ukraine much more, also in terms of military terms. So also kind of a Lend-Lease scheme or plan that was applied during the Second World War would be helpful. And when talking about Russian-speaking migrants, then they should please share this message with Russia and send it to Russia. The war has to stop, and people who are used as cannon fodder and sent to Ukraine have to be informed and educated through different networks, through messenger services, through direct communication. They have to understand that they will lose their lives in Ukraine. But if they say we're not going to wage war, well, then they are confronted with huge risks. Many people say we don't want to be part of the war, so people leave the country, especially people from Ossetia, and we have to further develop this. So if Russian-speaking people are in touch with our colleagues and relatives and friends, then we need to use these contacts in a positive manner, and we can do this, I think.
2 humble ideas. The one is obviously just to continue either expressing or doing the support you were able to, and I think this goes to all of us. But the other point is, because obviously this is not only a war that is happening physically in Ukraine, but this is a war of twisting history, of narratives, of values and everything else. And obviously there are people around us, neighbors, family, who share different views. They believe in alternative facts. do not dehumanize them, because this would make you similar to what those are doing that you do not agree with. So have the resilience and the patience that we ask of the Ukrainian peoples these days yourselves in arguing with them, and have the patience and the somehow understanding that they, because of who they are, where they came from, the environment they grew up in, the facts that they are reading or the alternative facts they're reading is the reason for them sharing these views. So see what you can do to bring them in a conversation and try over time to maybe have an impact on their opinions.
My two tasks and wishes also to myself and to all of us are: we have been talking about Ukraine a lot, and we have learned a lot what people think about Ukraine, and sometimes it is really shocking to hear this. And often I realize that many of the narratives that we also know from the Kremlin have arrived here in the mainstream. So they say no to the right of existence to Ukraine, or they ask, aren't they anti-Semites? So I cannot actually focus on the entire list. I'm sure that we have all been confronted with this, so we have to be attentive and we have to argue against these things. It is shocking to see how many narratives crop up again and again. That's my first thing. Second task. From the Kyiv conversations, or at the Kyiv conversations, we published a call yesterday, I think, or today. In the occupied territories, we see many hijackings of mayors and journalists, but it is basically directed against representatives of local democracy. And this is what was limited administratively in Russia already, but it's happening very brutally in Ukraine. It is intimidation and actually hijacks and abductions. Let us watch what is happening there. Let us make sure that we can protect these people as best as possible and to raise attention and awareness about them. Deliver more weapons. Anti-missile systems is the first task. Second, more sanctions. There are still many German companies that still do business with Russia. They are now talking about potential oil and gas embargoes. So do everything so that Russia cannot wage this war anymore. And thirdly, as I said, we need to develop a prospect for Ukraine. Neutral status. Germany and France have not yet decided what to do. They are somehow against it. But this is a unique historic chance for the EU. The EU can prove that it can do something in the area of peace and security and spread peace and security. And fourth task, international presence in Ukraine. I wish to see more policymakers traveling to Ukraine, like the presidents of Poland, Slovenia, and the Czech Republic did. So I want to see Olaf Scholz and Emmanuel Macron travel to Kiev. With the help of Marie-Louise Beck and Ralf Fuchs, they are now in Kiev. They have been there for 2 days. They had the Center for Liberal Modernity, and they are there to send out a political signal. And it's important that also ambassadors return to Kiev. The Polish ambassador returned to Kiev. The German embassy is still closed. So I think it is important to also work in that direction.
Yeah.
Thank you very much for the discussion, and also for the contributions from the floor and for your input. It's a broad picture we dealt with here. It's a dramatic picture. We are in the middle of a war and no one knows how long it will still go on. We can do something by trying to influence the conditions that enable that war to be continued, and we must explain to others what is going on. war times require a different agenda than peace times, and we must accept that, and we need to switch energies to that new agenda. So the first and foremost priority is to overcome the war, to end the war, to overcome the dictatorships, to overcome imperial policies. We will now have a break to give you a chance to talk, to eat, to drink something. Shortly after 7 we will reassemble here because we have a number of people giving us their greetings, their good wishes, and telling us briefly about what they do in their countries. So that will happen at 7, but it will not be my responsibility. Thank you for your attention. It was, I think, important to have such a discussion.